In the last video, we showed some very simple steps into creating those parent-child relationships that will offer us the complexity to do our robot arm exercise later on. Now I want to take that further and show a demonstration of how those principles are applied once we have those parenting relationships in place. So to do that, I'm going to create a new composition, or you can use the one you had from the last video. Create a quick composition here, and I'm going to create a few quick solids. So I'm going to make this one just slightly smaller. So I'm going to make this one 300 by 300. If you want to scale down the example you had in the last version, that's just fine. And then I'm going to duplicate this one, and I am going to make it just slightly smaller like we did in the last lesson. So layer solid settings, we'll bring those over here, and I'm going to make this one, let's do 150 by 150. Nice tiny little guy there. And then the last object that I want to create is going to think of it like a very long antenna of some sort. So I'm going to duplicate this one more time, and then I'm going to go into my layer solid settings, and I'm going to say the height is, let's say 500, and the width 20. There we go. That looks a very thin and flimsy antenna-like object. The reason I went through the solid settings and didn't just scale this is because I wanted to be kind of crisp on the edges. So if you just use scale, you should be okay. You might see a little bit of, your edges might be a little less clean, but for the most part, you'll be all right. So let's name these. I'll name this base. I'll name this head because it kind of looks like a head, and we'll name this one, we'll just call it ant for antenna, so that way I don't force you to spell the word antenna, and I don't misspell it on this video here. Let's set up our parenting, shall we? Because what we're going to do is we're going to make the base move, want the head to follow along, and the antenna to drag behind as it would in a real scenario. So which one's the parent? That would be the base. It's going to control everything. Therefore, the head needs to be parented to the base. So we can use this drop down and click base, which gets that done. We can test that right there. Looks good. Or we can use what I call the cinnamon bun. It's not really a cinnamon bun icon, of course, but it looks like one, so you know what I'm talking about. And then we want to parent the antenna to the head. We'll use the cinnamon bun for that particular one. So now we have a pretty good structure here. So the base moves, the head moves, and the antenna follows along in third place. Looking pretty sharp. So now if I use my position keyframes, let's go ahead and go 15 frames in, and I'm going to create a position keyframe for the base only. I'm going to have the base kind of start there, go 15 frames in. We're going to have it back up in a movement of anticipation. Then I'm going to advance to say maybe, let's say 2 seconds in, and it is going to sprint across the screen. I'm just using the shift and arrow keys so that the movement's precise. And about right there. So maybe that's 90% of the way across the screen. And then it's going to stop. And so here's what we've got. Zip, zap. Looking pretty good. And by pretty good, I mean it is the simplest of animations we could be expected to produce. So nothing really to praise ourselves about too much. It does move a little bit slow for my taste, so I'm going to shorten that just slightly. So it's going to take about 30% of a second to get across there instead of a full second. So whips a little bit faster. I did this because the follow-through that we're going to create will be more convincing and it'll just be more fun if this object moves in a more intense way. If it's really slow, then we wouldn't see a whole lot of drag, right? If you can imagine Bugs Bunny or some other classic cartoon, when they get ready to sprint off screen, when they walk very slowly, their objects don't drag very much. But when they sprint off screen in kind of a comical frenzy, their ears, their neck, sometimes even their head lags behind in this serious and extreme drag, right? So we got to move pretty quick in order to create that drag. All right, next. The antenna needs to kind of lag and drag far behind. So how do we do that? Well, let's start by identifying where the object starts to move. So it backs up a little bit. So we'd actually see a little bit of like pre-drag there. So from this spot to this spot, we want that antenna to kind of react. Let's get out our rotation keyframes. We're going to hit the R key on our ant layer. And I'm going to set a keyframe right at the beginning when our position, our anticipation movement starts to start. And then where it changes direction, that's kind of what I want to cause that antenna to like start to move the other direction. So let's go ahead and rotate it a little bit. When I do that, we notice something undesired occurs. My antenna doesn't rotate from the point in which we believe it's connected to the head. In fact, it rotates up in the middle, which looks pretty unconvincing. Now we notice this with our squash and stretch and some of our previous examples that it would be ideal if we could tell our layer to rotate at the bottom where it appears to be connected to the head. So let's back off those keyframes, and we're going to make that change first, because if we make the change after animation occurs, it kind of screws everything up. So let's make that change first. We're going to bring out a new tool called the pan behind. It's also known as the anchor point tool. And it's right next to the camera icon. It's by the shape icon. So it looks like a little bit of a baseball diamond, I always like to say. But it's called pan behind. Click that, and then know that once you do, you can change this crosshair on your layer to any place you want to in your scene. And that is the pivot point. And the pivot point is really, really important when doing things like, making a pivot movement defined by rotation. So now if I do that exact same movement with that pivot point placed properly at the bottom there, I can use the rotation tool, and I can bend this antenna, and it bends in the right spot, and that's really cool and way more satisfying, and it's just more believable. So I'm going to rotate this just slightly, because with that anticipation movement, it's a little bit slow, so it starts to go back just a ways. All right, so back, and shifts direction. So that's where our rotation should start shifting direction as well. And as we move here, I'll go maybe halfway through the movement. I'll start to really bend this guy back. I'm still using rotation keyframes, making sure that pivot point's in the right spot. And so I'm just going to scrub the timeline, see how it looks. So we have a little bit of like a pre-coil there, then whoa, huge drag. And I'm going to have the drag get even more intense with those last few frames, as though the the speed and intensity of this movement is really taken over. Now, when the object hits, we have to have follow through. So we've established the drag, which is nice, but now we have that follow through. So this antenna is going to then move to the other direction because of all that movement. And it's up to you if you want to make it look like it bounces off the screen here, or if you want it to go further. I'm going to have mine go off screen a little bit. So zip, it goes all the way off, and then recoils backward, maybe half its distance, and then recoils, coils back forward, maybe half the distance. And this is almost like the half-life of a bounce, right? It keeps going like maybe half the distance until it finally settles. And then here, and then here. And you can kind of just guess on this, kind of eyeball it. In truth, if this was really an antenna, there would be tons of these little microscopic, kind of vibrations and bounces back and forth. We can just kind of do our best guess for this example. Pretty nice. Let's see that one more time. Pretty nice. Cool. Looks pretty sharp. Now, the follow-through portion, though, works fine on the antenna, but I feel like if this object was moving as fast as it is, perhaps there'd have to be some sort of reaction in the base here to make that more believable. So let's go ahead and make the similar change to the base that we did to the object up here. So we're going to use the pan behind tool, and we're going to run a wrist. We've already created position keyframes, which usually kind of spells disaster if you're going to start moving the pivot point. But if we have to, we'll move the pivot point with each of these keyframes to try and make it look as good as possible. So here's what we notice. The pivot point for that keyframe, first one was up top, now it's down below. So what's going to happen to our animation? Now our block moves up, because in the other two keyframes, the pivot point is now at the bottom. So we have to kind of make some adjustments to our position keyframes because of how that pivot point moved. So if it were me, I'd probably just delete these very simple position keyframes and redo them. So that way I could make sure that the pivot point's in the right spot. The other thing we could do is just, since it's only two keyframes, let's just go ahead and hold the shift key and move these straight down. Or we could do this with the numeric panel. So what do we got? 1044 on the Y value. Easy enough. And let's get that last one. Once again, 1044. So we're not only learning some principles, but a little bit of troubleshooting and the value of planning. So now that we know where we want our pivot point to be. Now, if we want this thing to kind of rock forward, perhaps we want our pivot point truly to be over here on this right corner. It's probably the truth. So let's go ahead and while we're at it and while we're planning, let's go ahead and make that pivot point truly in the right spot. So move that to the right. And it really doesn't look that bad because of how we did it that time. So that's lucky. All right, now to our rotation keyframes. So we've got this charge, and then boom, it hits. So let's assume it hits like a curb or something, and that's what causes it to stop so abruptly. So now we'll want to hold shift and bring up our rotation keyframes for the base layer. I'll turn on that stopwatch. I'm going to rotate forward. Ooh, and it pivots so nicely on that anchor point or pivot point. And then, maybe a brief moment of hang time there where it just kind of barely comes back down. And then we'll copy that first keyframe and then we'll let it truly drop back down and see how that looks. Nice, much more believable. Now that we've seen that follow through, the object didn't just come to an unnatural stop, but it kind of followed through a little bit because of the energy of that movement. We could do the same thing with the head object. Right now it's not really playing a key role in our animation, but the head object could have a little spring to it or a little rotation, and so on and so forth. And since we haven't animated the head, we could move its pivot point without a whole lot of penalty. So if we move the head object's pivot point down to that bottom right corner, we could back up, and right about this moment where it hits that object, we could do a little rotation there. So I've got this, and just to see how it looks. So rotation keyframe. Oops, still using pan behind. Rotation keyframe, and then come back down and settle, if you would please. Let's see. Book. Not bad. Maybe a few things are a little too fast or a little too slow to be truly believable, but we can see that the drag makes things really convincing. The follow through is really nice. And we notice that there is in fact overlapping action because we didn't wait until the blocks animated one at a time in order to kind of compound these motions. If you look, here is the example of our overlapping action. Block 1, block 2, block 3, all moving at once to kind of create this more fluid movement versus block 1 hitting, tipping, settling, block 2 then tipping, settling, and then block 3, the antenna, tipping, settling. That would look really, really unnatural. So we have to have all these things kind of happening at once in order to truly be believable. So that is our drag, that is our follow through, and that is our overlapping action.